I'm Steve Seidensticker.
Hi everyone. For this project we are going to take this Bachmann Spectrum brand new Climax and convert it from track to battery power and add a BlueRailDCC capability so that the user can actually run it from a smartphone. The primary components that will be going into this conversion is a charging jack, which will fit under the cab, right under the floor here. This is, of course, a charging cable that will plug into the charging jack. This is a simple on-off switch that will allow the user just to completely turn the locomotive on or off. This is an air-wire lithium battery, 3,400 milliamp hours, that actually will run this locomotive for several hours on a full charge. And here we have the BlueRailDCC receiver board that will take the signals from an application on a smartphone to control sound and speed and direction and, of course, lights. Now, as far as I can tell, this locomotive comes with DCC installed by Bachmann at the factory. One way to determine whether or not this is really the case is to just apply some voltage to the wheels, which we're going to do right now. And we hear it starting up and lights flashing in the firebox, but no turning of the wheels yet. Let's just up the voltage a little bit. Well, got a little bit more life there. 3 toots, that usually indicates that it wants to start off going in reverse. Now let's bump it up to 16 volts, see what happens. All right, there we go. Let's go in the opposite direction. Locomotive seems to work pretty well. Let's start the rest of the process. The next step is to remove the fuel bunker from the frame. And to do that, there are 4 screws holding it from the bottom. One here, and of course 2 corresponding on the other side. On this version of this locomotive, or the more recent production runs that also include the DCC decoder, they have a couple of sandboxes on the back of the fuel bunker that just snap off, and they reveal some of the switches behind it. Let's see if we can get them off. Aha, there's one. And there's 2, and we have a battery versus track pickup, a large scale versus NMRA polarity switch, motor on-off switch, and a DCC versus DC on the lights switch. Well, we will set those up later after we get the receiver in. Now that we have all 4 screws out of the bottom of the fuel bunker, let's see if we can get it off of the frame. Sometimes we have to tilt it in one direction or the other because there are little tabs. Let us take the coal load off first. And let us, as you will notice, there's a small cooling fan attached to the bottom of the coal load itself, which connects to a small connector right here on the electronics, and let us remove that while we're at it. That will give us a clear working area for doing whatever we have to do. The next step is to remove the cab roof. It is held on by 4 screws right at the top corners of the cab. One here, one underneath right about here, and another one there. Okay, we have all 4 screws out. The cab should lift right off. And the windows fell in, but we will fix that later. One of the things also that's significant about this is that there's no wiring to the rear light that is mounted on top of the cab. The contact for that light and for the cab light on the interior is through these spring-loaded contacts and the contacts right here on the front wall of the cab. This is a very nice locomotive, lots of detail. You can see in here a lot of valves, a lot of piping, etc. It's really a very, very detailed model. One of the things that happens when you're disassembling models is you end up with a bunch of screws of different sizes. And if you just put all the screws in one container, which I sometimes do, I end up not being able to figure out which size screw goes to fit which component together. So lately I've taken up the habit of just inserting the screws after I take them out into the components that they came from, and just starting the screw and turning it in part way. That way I know where that particular screw goes when I am reassembling the locomotive. Now that we have disassembled the locomotive to the point that we can get at the electronics, let's take a close look at them. The basic board that drives all the lights in the motor is this larger one here that has all of these wires connected to it. On top of that, you will see the factory installed Bachmann DCC board. The board is actually made by a company called Soundtracks, and this board is unique in that they make it directly for Bachmann and it is not for sale on the open market. The actual connection between the BlueRail board that we're going to put into the locomotive right here and the locomotive itself is quite simple. There are 2 screw terminals here that say battery 18 volts. There's another one here that says battery 6 volts that we can ignore. It's for a sound system that we will not be using. And here to the side is a switch that says track versus battery, and we have just turned this over to the battery. And in a minute we are going to lay the locomotive on its side, put some power on it, and see if it works. All right, we've got the power hooked up. We've got the Bluetooth board connected to the Bluetooth app on an iPad by my side. Let's see if something happens. Let's try the horn. Hey, 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 how about a short horn? How about a bell? Sounds good. Now for the test. Let's see if we can make it go forward. How about that? Brake squeal and everything. Right, John just heard the Johnson bar shifted into reverse. Let's try going backwards. All right, that will do for the initial test. We know that the basic system will work if it's wired up correctly. Now all we have to do is figure out how to get a charging jack, a battery, an on-off switch, and this board all into the locomotive and tied up neatly. All right, here comes the tricky part, or the fun part. Going to do a little dentistry or a little minor surgery, and we're going to drill a 5/16 hole and 2 1/4-inch holes right about here through the floor of the cab, right in front of the fireman's position. Okay, let's have a little fitting of the battery. It is going to go right in here in the fireman's position. And he just fits. We'll take the label off so it is not distracting. It sticks out a little bit. But a little bit later, when we wire everything up, we will just glue the battery into position, and it will not be very obtrusive at all. Here's the way the charging jack and the on-off switch will reside. It turns out to be a lot easier to wire them before we mount them in the holes in the floor of the cab. The complete circuit between the BlueRail board and the battery and these devices is shown in this diagram.
Here we're looking at the bottom of the locomotive, and we see the on-off switch and the charging jack mounted in the holes that we drilled earlier. The third hole shows the wires coming out that will go back to the BlueRail board. Here we have the 2 wires coming up from the bottom of the locomotive to the fuel bunker area through a hole that was conveniently made for us there by the factory.
Now that we have the charging jack and the on-off switch installed, we have these 2 leads coming up from those 2 components, and we have the red and white leads coming from the battery, which I just installed. And since this is going to be a permanent battery installation, I'm going to actually cut off the connector. One thing I would like to mention is if you're ever cutting off the leads of a battery, do not try to cut them off both at the same time. Otherwise, they will short the battery through the cutter as you're cutting both wires. Now, if I wired everything correctly, I can make a quick check. I've hooked up an voltmeter, set it on DC volts, and when I turn the switch on that is now mounted under the cab, it should show the voltage of the battery, which I just did, and there it shows 14.23 volts. Now what I'm going to do is insert a plug into the charge port, and the voltage should shut off. What you see the figures of just a few millivolts of floating voltage, which is essentially off. Okay, the final wiring test, of course, is to turn the locomotive on after the BlueRail board has been installed and everything is connected to the battery. Light comes on, Background sound comes on in the locomotive, which is good. Blow the whistle. Bell. Voila! Looks like we have a good wiring job. Go in reverse just to make sure. The next step was to mount the BlueRail board. About the only space for it is underneath the coal load, which just sits on top of the fuel bunker of the locomotive. The space was occupied by a fairly large cooling fan right in the center, and so I substituted 2 smaller cooling fans. The BlueRail board is just mounted with double-sided foam tape, and that normally holds well enough. And the cooling fans are held down with silicone.